Hello, this is me, Russell Brand, on YouTube, introducing our entire free Luminary podcast with Eckhart Tolle. He's not called Eckhart, is he? I mean, there's enough people not sure how to pronounce the second bit. Tolle. I went with Tolle the whole time I was speaking to him. Eckhart Tolle. But let's not start saying Eckhart. That's confusing for all of us. So Eckhart Tolle is a spiritual teacher, you know that, right? And an author. He's introduced millions to the freedom of living in the present. I want to promote Eckhart's Conscious Manifestation online course. Starts on June the 25th at eckharttolle.com. Eckhart shows us how this time of challenge and accelerated change is an opportunity to manifest from the awakened state of consciousness. I don't think so. He doesn't want us to awaken from... He doesn't want us to awaken from being awake. I mean, where do you go from awaken, Jen? You know, we're including a link in the description. Use that link because then people will know that Russ gets things done. You can listen to more episodes of Under the Skin only from Luminary on luminarypodcast.com. You can get a subscription for as little as $2.99 a month. There's loads of good people on there. Trevor Noah, Karamo, Lena Dunham, me. Hundreds of hours of stuff. It's bloody good. It's not available in all markets though. What you thought it was going to be in all markets? It ain't in Chaz, for example. So enjoy this conversation between me and Eckhart Tolle.
Thank you for making time for us.
Well, thank you. It's the next best thing to meeting in person. I hope that will happen also soon.
Yes, I hope so. Eckhart, Jenny, who produces this show, has asked if I can ask you if you can record the audio on your phone so that we have that additionally.
Okay.
If that's convenient for you.
Let me just see whether I have this big microphone here. I'm not
Eckhart's
sure.
just produced a magnificent microphone. I've never seen anything like it. It's extraordinary.
So,
have a look. I mean, I can't see.
I can see it on this.
Oh yeah, you're monitoring.
It's a Larry King mic. Don't
Very
go
much.
away. Stay tuned. We'll just take a short break.
Is it operable or is it merely an icon?
Because it is operable, but because I'm computer illiterate, I forgot to ask Brooke, who I was just talking to show me how to connect the mic. Where to go? Just a second.
Well, when I asked Eckhart about whether or not he was recording on his phone, he produced such an enormous microphone, Jen, that the subject of recording on his phone was entirely obliterated. Well, I think it's good. Jenny, do you want to have a listen? This is Jenny Eckhart.
Oh.
Yeah, it sounds good. It'd be good to get it on the phone as well, I think.
Sound good enough?
Yeah, it does sound good.
If you don't want to record it on your phone, you certainly don't have to. I don't want to oblige you to undertake more technical tasks than you're comfortable with. I mean, you have already shown us that enormous mic. Shall I begin the podcast? I mean, we could use this. I mean, I think people would like seeing and hearing your reference to that ludicrous Larry King phallus that you were brandishing.
Eckhart, ever since I've been doing this podcast, I've wanted to have you as a guest. So I'm very grateful to you for coming on. But also, isn't it extraordinary that that it's at this peculiar moment with the pandemic and with the how to describe what's happening in America, the reemergence of civil rights. What do you feel about this particular historic moment? Do you think that something significant is happening?
Yes, we live at the time of great change and also a time of enormous adversity too, which started with the virus, and great change and adversity are actually inseparable, because humans will not change unless they are faced with obstacles and adversity. So I believe there's a connection between the coronavirus and this movement that just started now for racial equality and so on. the virus presented an enormous challenge for millions of people. And every challenge is an opportunity for waking up. We may need to talk about what exactly I mean by waking up or awakening. It means, of course, a challenge, whatever form it takes, whether it comes on a personal level, just affecting you, or whether a challenge happens collectively when there's a huge challenge or some form of adversity that suddenly arises in the collective, and it challenges millions of people. And this is what happened with the virus. And in the face of challenge, whether it's of a personal kind or a collective kind, you cannot stay the way you are. You can go either one way or the other. So one way is a challenge makes you more unconscious. It pushes you deeper into egoic reactivity and negativity and conflict with other human beings becomes magnified. So one effect that a challenge can have on a human being is it can make him or her more unconscious, more reactive, more deeply entrenched in the egoic patterns. The other thing, on the other hand, a challenge can have the effect of forcing you to become more conscious. And I have experienced it in my own life when faced with the challenges of life. Before I went through a kind of shift in consciousness when I was 29, whenever something bad happened around me, I would usually go into reactive mode and become very unhappy or angry or even more depressed than I was already. And so it's very important to realize that the importance of using the adversity that inevitably arises in everybody's life, often just on a personal level or on a collective level, to recognize that as an opportunity for becoming more conscious instead of less conscious, for awakening out of the egoic mind patterns. So maybe I should talk for a moment about what I actually mean by awakening.
Yes, and what characterizes these egoic mind patterns. Those would be two areas to good to have further detail on.
Now, the ego, which is a mind-made sense of self, a mind-made identity that consists of narratives, thoughts that you identify with. It's the earliest story about the rising of the ego is the Myth of Narcissus. This is, of course, where the word narcissism comes from, and every ego is a kind of has very strong narcissistic elements to it. The story of Narcissus is there was a young man, very beautiful, in ancient Greece. And this young man, because that was a time before mirrors were invented and before we had the wonderful invention of selfies, he had never seen himself. And one day he looked into a pool of water and he saw his own reflection. And he was so fascinated by his own reflection. The story says that he fell in love with himself, but my interpretation is really that he became obsessed with himself, but not with himself, with the image of himself. And after that, he was no longer a happy person. There are various versions of that story, but his life didn't go well after that. So that, I believe, there's sometimes very deep wisdom embodied in mythology, in myth. What it points to is the arising of the human ego, which is a kind of phantom self that you carry around, that you mistake for who you actually are. It consists of identifications with possessions, identification with your own body, including, of course, the color of your skin. It's part of your own body. Identification with things that you can do, abilities, things you know. Identification with all kinds of things. Now, what does it mean, identification with? It means you derive your sense of self from something that is not you. So let's say it's my car. And it could start for a little child who gets a toy car. And so the child is given a toy car, and that's the beginning of the ego, is the feeling of the child, this is mine. So there's a certain identification with the toy, a self-identification. So it enhances, because it only works if another child does not have that toy, then it really works. This is my car. So it enhances a certain sense of identity. And identity is something that humans desperately seek after meeting the needs of shelter and food and shelter. One could almost say the next thing after that is the psychological need in human beings for a sense of identity. They need to that, and the first thing that humans do, and you cannot, there's no preventing this. They seek an identity by identifying with this, that, or the other. Later, the adult may have a car and derives part of their sense of identity from having this car, but it only works because it's compared. The ego is comparative, the image in your mind of who you are. It only works because other people don't have it. So imagine you have a Rolls Royce. I assume you don't, but imagine you have a Rolls Royce, and it enhances your sense of self. Every time you look at it, you sit in it, you are seen by other people. It enhances your identity, your sense of self. Now imagine a scenario where, let's say there's a kind of a twilight zone. Suddenly you wake up in a reality where every human being at the age of 20 is given the same Rolls Royce. Everybody drives exactly the same Rolls Royce. Suddenly it would no longer serve to enhance your identity, because you have nothing to compare itself to, because the ego needs, ultimately it seeks some kind of superiority. It compares itself to others in one way or another. It seeks some kind of superiority over others. It's an unconscious process. It wants to emphasize what I call your form identity. This is me. And this is a normal process. There's no point in wanting to stop it from happening. A child needs to go that way until finally an egoic sense of self is formed. And when we talk about identification, what are we really talking about? Let's say you identify with a possession or with an achievement, or you identify with the way you look. And that could give you a happy identity, because you look better than most. This is for you, that's probably the case. For me, that was not the case. I did not look great. So when my ego was developing, it could not enhance its identity by focusing on that, because my body didn't look great, and my ego was looking for other ways to identify with. But I assume in your case, for example, your ego, when it grew, to some extent identified with the way you look, because the ego always seeks the most obvious thing. And I would have been very happy to be as handsome as you when I was young, but it was not the case. I had to find something else to identify with. And I finally found intellectual knowledge, I thought of myself, I started reading books, and I thought, oh, I'm actually more intelligent than most people. So an image formed in my mind that this is me, and there's always an unease behind it, because the ego is never feels really at ease or fulfilled. There's always an underlying sense of lack, of insufficiency, of not enough. I am not enough. Because ultimately it's only a mental image that you mistake for who you are. It's often associated with a narrative in your mind that tells you about my life. You call it my life. Me and my life. This is me. This is my life. People have a relationship with themselves. Isn't that strange? They have a relationship with them. So this is why you have to... I hate myself. I love myself. In both cases, it's better to love yourself than to hate yourself. But in both cases, there's a duality, there's a split that has happened. There's you, and there's a self that you either hate or love. So the question is, if there is the self that you either hate or love, who are you? Who is the one that hates or loves that self? What is going on here? The dog does not have that problem, because the dog has not arrived yet at ego. The dog has no self-image. The dog does not live, or your cat. I saw your wonderful video about the death of your cat, just very profound and beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
Your cat the animal does not yet have an ego, so the dog is itself. The dog has no problem with body image or self-esteem, because the dog is, and this is why most animals are more joyous than, less problematic than humans. They do not carry the weight of the self, what the Buddha called the self. And the Buddha, one of the main teachings of the Buddha is to recognize the unreality of the self, that it is a mental construct that you mistake for who you are. So ultimately, even if you identify with a possession which seems to be out there, the only way you can experience a possession is as a thought form in your mind. So ultimately, all the egoic identifications come down to thought forms, because that's the only way in which you can experience all these identifications. So ultimately, it all boils down to one thing. What you identify with is your thoughts, plus some emotions that go with those thoughts. So the ego ultimately is, when you first look at it, seems identification with all kinds of different things out there. But when you look at it more closely, all these different things that the ego identified with are all experienced as thought forms. So the ego, then the essence of ego, you could say, is complete identification with thoughts. So, and the recurring thoughts in your mind that tell you who you are, that's the ego. And for people who are unconscious of that, they are so in the grip of these thought forms that they are virtually asleep. There's nobody there other than the dream of thought, the phantom self. So waking up means to suddenly recognize that the thoughts that go through your head continuously, but also the emotions that reflect those thoughts, are not who you are. So even the first beginning of awakening, spiritual awakening, one could say, is to recognize that certain thoughts are continuously arising in your mind, and you, for a moment, you have stepped out of that, and you recognize it's a stepping back, one could say. Or before your consciousness, one could say, was completely absorbed by these continuously arising thought forms, and you couldn't You know how it is when people are in the grip of the stream of thinking that never stops except when you go to sleep. And you're hardly aware of your surroundings. And everything you see you interpret through the screen of the conditioned mind, which is the ego. It's a very, and this entity is ultimately a fiction. And so it is now coming back to adversity. When you're faced with some kind of adversity or challenge in your life, then the ego becomes the unhappiness of the ego and the negativity of the ego gets greatly enhanced. So the adversity makes you very deeply unhappy or negative and reactive. It creates a lot of suffering, enormous amount of suffering. But even at the best of times, the ego needs some kind of antagonist. It needs always the other because it defines itself through the other, the one who is not different from me, who is not me. It needs not only the other, it needs to emphasize what I call the otherness of the other. So you have an encapsulated sense of self that depends on its survival for ultimately, to put it bluntly, having enemies out there. It needs the other because its identity would begin to dissolve without the other. For example, let's say in the case of race, let's say there's a person whose ego is to a large extent defined by their race. Now, whether it's black or white or yellow or what it may be, but that is only possible because a certain segment of the people around you are of a different race. Then you can define your ego through identification with that. And the ego seeks enemies. Implied in that is also that it seeks superiority. So it feels it needs to it needs to tell itself that it's superior to somebody else. So if you identify with, perhaps the essence of racism, of course, is in the human mind. That's where it starts. Before racism becomes externalized as behavior, and then externalized further as it manifests in the form of economic and social institutions and systems that we create. Before all that happens, the ego the root of the ego must be sought in the human mind. That's where it starts. And how does it start? It starts with identification with a thought form that says, this is me, I'm this color, and there's the other who is less than me. It starts with that. And that's a terrible thing. The ego does that. Whenever you do that, it's not just race. That's only one example. There are many other ways in which the ego does that. When a person who is totally in the grip of the ego cannot meet you. When you talk to this person or you come together, this person sees you through an image that he or she arises in their egoic mind that they have created for you. And very quickly they create an image. They cannot relate to you. They relate to their own mental image of you. And that's a terrible thing to do to a human being. What you're actually doing is you're imposing an identity on the other and see the other through this fiction of an identity. And so you're never meeting that human being at all. You're only meeting the constructs of your mind. So there's always that total separation with the other. And that makes that which makes you truly a human being, these qualities like empathy, compassion, love, cannot arise when you're trapped in the egoic sense of self, the ego doesn't want these things. It cannot survive these things. So it's a false sense of self that people live through, and the awakening can begin with realizing that you are not the thoughts that go through your mind. That's the beginning. Now, what has arisen at that moment? Awareness. Suddenly, you realize that there is a dimension of consciousness in you that's not thinking, but just conscious. That is the awakening, when you realize that you are underneath it all your sense perceptions, all your thoughts, underneath it all, there's this vast realm of conscious presence. There is a presence there, without which you wouldn't be able to perceive anything, you wouldn't be able to think anything. It arises, it's a little bit like, I compare it sometimes to, before you live on the surface of the ocean, you're a little ripple on the surface of the ocean. And this ripple only knows itself as a ripple. And it looks at other ripples and sometimes feels threatened by other ripples or wants to use other ripples to enhance its own sense of self. And it's always fearful. It always compares itself to other ripples. Very unpleasant and frustrating way to live. It hasn't realized the depth of its being, because the ripple is only a temporary expression of the vastness of the ocean. But it doesn't know that. So if the ripple for a moment comes to us, if the continuous thought, in this analogy, the ripple, of course, is the human being, and the ripple, when the ripple stops thinking for a moment, and this is the key, for a moment, you come to a cessation of the stream of thinking. And what's left when you're not thinking about your history, your personal history, or the future? You're just becoming aware of this moment, yourself, this moment. But what is that self? It's no longer the historical self. You can't say very much about it. There is an underlying sense of presence, of alive, conscious presence. It's still, it's alive. And there's not much you can say about it. It's always been there. But it's always, before you realize that, until then, it had been overlooked continuously. Because sensory perception and thought, especially thought activity, is so noisy that you are not aware of that underlying dimension. It's a bit like, let's say, one could use another analogy. This is a strange analogy. Let's say you are a room, and the room wants to know, who am I? So the room would say, well, there's this furniture here, there's the sofa and the chairs and the table, and there's the wall and the ceiling and the floor, and there's this and that. That's me. To describe itself in terms of content, the content. And then you ask the room, is there anything that you have missed that you are? No, because you're looking for more content. No, I've listed, this is all the content of that, what I am. And then suddenly, perhaps, you point out, haven't you missed the essence of who you are? And that's the space. That's the space in this room. Is the essence of the room. Is not the content in the room. It's the space of this room. That's the essence. But the room had never been aware of that. That its essence is this space that can never be destroyed. That is actually timeless. And in this analogy, that space is the space of consciousness within you. So you are not the content of your mind, ultimately, because the content of your mind, that is your form identity. that includes all the things that constitute who you are on the level of form, which is the body, things you interact with, all the things, sense perceptions and thoughts. Every thought is a thought form. So you, on that level, and there's nothing wrong with form identity. You have to honor your form identity, acknowledge it, honor it. You can honor your form identity also racially. You can honor the color of your skin and perhaps cultural things that you are associated with your ancestors. You can honor all that. But if that is all you know, it's not enough. You have this, that still keeps you trapped in a very limited sense of self, and you still need the other to be in some way inferior, whatever way. Or on the one hand, you honor the world of form and your form identity, your body also. You don't say, I no longer believe that I'm my body, I'm not paying attention. No, you honor your body, you give it food, exercise, nutrition, you do the best you can. You honor it, but you're not confined by it because you realize that all that is to do with the content of consciousness. So I call that sometimes object consciousness. That the two dimensions in your life, you have object consciousness, which is all the things that arise in your mind. Every thought is an object, it's a form that arises. Every emotion is a form that arises. All this is object consciousness, and that's the content of your life, consists of this, lots of things continuously arising and subsiding, It's object consciousness. For most people, that's all they ever know in their life. And then object consciousness, this is all you know, and you know nothing else. You do not know the deeper dimension, which I call, it sounds a little bit like science fiction, I call it space consciousness. So you have object consciousness, which is your daily life, frustrating if you don't know yourself as the underlying space consciousness, then to only inhabit object consciousness is very frustrating, because object consciousness is never satisfying for very long, and it's continuously challenging, very frustrating. One damn thing after another arises. You sort out one thing in your life, another problem crops up there. You never, when you only live in object consciousness, you have a feeling you never arrive anywhere. You're always trying to get somewhere. You never feel, I have arrived, and if you do, it's very short-lived. And then you realize, oh no, I haven't arrived. Whether it's fame or some kind of achievement or getting this or that, falling in love, I have arrived. No, you haven't. You haven't. So the same person that gives you the illusion that you have arrived because you've fallen in love, this person makes you happy. 2 years later, the same person makes you unhappy. You haven't arrived. That's wedding and divorce is what I'm talking about. It's very common. Nothing satisfies you for very long, and things continuously leave you too. The Buddha talked about all that when he talked about the impermanence of all things. So this is object consciousness. Object consciousness is frustrating, and ultimately and as you grow older, you become more and more disillusioned with the world, and you think you become kind of often bitter and resentful, and you've seen it all, and it's all your opinions are very rigid and fixed. You know it all, and you've seen it all. Don't tell me about this, I know. And your reactive patterns, and you've missed the most important thing in human life, which is the awareness of space consciousness. And when I say the awareness of space consciousness, it's an error that is through language. Language is a subject and an object, but it's not the awareness of space consciousness. The awareness is the space consciousness. So in space consciousness it's so simple to become aware of, just for in a moment of no thought, but you haven't fallen asleep, you haven't fallen below thought. I call it, you can either rise above thinking, like right now in this moment, I can see you, and in this moment, you are present, but not thinking. There's nothing to think about. And in this moment, I am present, but not thinking. I'm not preparing the next thing I'm going to say, it just comes out. And you're not preparing the next question you're going to ask, but it'll come, but you don't need to prepare it. So you become familiar with that state of spacious awareness. And that is your essence identity. To be rooted in that, it's ultimately very simple. I don't know why they don't teach that at school. I mean, the most important life lesson is the transcendent dimension of life, of who you are. To find all the ancient teachings using different terms and different words, they all point to this possibility of realizing the transcendent dimension of who you are. Whether the Buddha calls it, the Buddha actually calls it, the translation is shunyata, emptiness, but the better translation would be spaciousness. That's the essence of who you are, shunyata, spaciousness. Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, which in my translation is not, I translated kingdom, I translated as dimension, and heaven, which is the vast heaven. When you look up at the sky, that's the closest thing you can get to spaciousness in the sense-perceived world. The closest thing you can get to spaciousness is to look at the vastness of the sky or heaven. In many languages, heaven and sky is the same word. So you look at the vastness of sky, which is vast spaciousness. So the kingdom of heaven is the dimension of spaciousness. It's a dimension of consciousness that is possible to realize, and it's not hugely difficult. This is why then they asked Jesus, where is the kingdom of heaven? When is it going to come? And he said, the kingdom of heaven cannot come with signs to be perceived. You can never say it's over here or it's over there, because the kingdom of heaven is within you. In fact, he was saying it is the essence of who you are. Consciousness is, but it's not only the essence of who you are, it's the essence of the universe itself, because you are just a microcosm of the universe. So when you realize the essence of who you are, the universe is realizing its own essence through you, this little thing, through you. It's such an amazing thing. Why this is not common knowledge, I don't know. Humans have been asleep. It's occasionally awake people were there, teachers and others we never heard of. I'm sure quite a few that we never heard of, that perhaps only were able to teach one or two people. And teach simply means to point the way. This, go there. It's not teaching in a spiritual sense, does not mean to add content to your mind. So normally when you say teach, you add content to the mind. But spiritual teaching is, one could almost say, to remove content and realize that beyond the content of your mind, there's a vast dimension of spacious presence. And once you awaken to that, it starts with a simple thing. You become aware of a gap between two thoughts. Become aware that when you first look at something, let's say you go out into nature and you look up at a tree, and always in the first moment of looking, there's no mental noise, because you're just there as a presence that's taking in the sense perception. 2 seconds later, perhaps, the mind begins to interpret it and says something about it. But if you can catch the first moment, whenever you use your sense perception, you're listening to something, a sound suddenly arises, and you pay attention and you listen, and in that alert listening or that alert seeing when you first look at something, you can become aware. That's a natural arising of spaciousness. You don't have to do a spiritual practice when you become aware of that. And when you become aware of that in the first moment of sensory perception, there's no mental interpretation yet of the sensory perception. When you become aware of that can actually be prolonged automatically. That the interval before you name it, before you classify it, before you interpret it, there's an interval of still, spacious presence. And that makes your whole life much more deeply enjoyable. You begin to actually enjoy this world of form, the object consciousness. Why do you enjoy it more now? Because you are no longer dependent on it for your deep sense of joy and satisfaction. So you're no longer at the mercy of what's either happening or not happening in your life. So you can allow this present moment to be as it is, because it already is. It would be madness to fight what is. Then you can take steps, yes, to change things, and that this is also the place where, of course, all intuition arises from that spacious presence, all creativity arises from that spacious presence, and what we call wisdom. Wisdom is a deeper intelligence, not just the analytical intelligence that can be measured with IQ tests. That's a tiny fragment of intelligence, IQ tests. By the way, I can't do IQ tests. I give up every time I see an IQ test. I say, what is this? My mind just doesn't go there. But I don't think it's a small aspect of intelligence. But what the world needs is not more knowledge, more intelligence, because if there's only intelligence without the awareness, the deeper dimension of the essence, that leads to destructiveness. You need intelligence to build atom bombs. You need intelligence to build chemical weapons, the most absurd things. You need intelligence to do that, but there's no wisdom there. So, the world is full of intelligent people, but not much wisdom. And if that continues, and science, for example, is only a more focused way of the mind being applied. Science without wisdom, which is intelligence without wisdom, ultimately will lead to disaster. So this waking up is vital. It's not hugely difficult. I don't understand why. Anyway, maybe I do understand, because there's we are coming. There is the gravitational pull of thousands of years of evolution and of the ego arising. So there's 1,000 of years that we carry around, and it's an amazing thing that then there are human beings now. I believe there are more than ever human beings who are awakening. You are doing the work that you do is also an important part of that, because you're bringing consciousness to the world, and that's the one thing that the world desperately needs. And then let's. I don't know what's happening now, where it's going. You asked, when we started, you asked about the events that are happening now. And of course, the answer is they can either go into egoic channels, and then they create more havoc. But eventually that's fine too, because eventually that too will awaken you. It just means more suffering has to come first. Or it may be possible of people who want to bring about change, that they are more conscious. And I love it when I see people demonstrating peacefully. Is a wonderful thing. Just a peaceful demonstration is where people are, and a peaceful demonstration does not demonize other human beings. That's the important thing. If you start demonizing or groups of humans, for example, because that is ego, and it's satisfying. It's so satisfying to the ego. I can say, look at these. It inflates the ego, which you can demon. Police, there's a lot that needs to be changed in the way policing, and there are, of course, policemen or women whose ego gets enormous satisfaction from the power they have, and the ego loves that you're very unconscious, but that it is absurd to say that all police are evil. It's just totally absurd. There are many good human beings who do a very difficult job, and yet, yes, we need to change the whole structure and the way that it is done. That's necessary. But then if we go further and then we go into another trap, which the egoic trap, and we go totally astray. But that's fine too. If that has to happen, then you will regress. And regression in consciousness is also a way of evolving. And that's an interesting fact, that the universe evolves not through order, the play between order and disorder, order and chaos, cosmos and chaos. Cosmos means order, chaos means disorder. So we need the two operate continuously, both in a personal life and in the life of the collective. We always think of course, we should strive for order in our lives. It's good to strive for building things up, creating things. That's all part of order, creating things, building things up, and so on. But no matter, although you should strive for order, no matter how much you strive, you will encounter the eruption of disorder into your life in one way or another. It cannot, because that's how the universe evolves. Everything, when I walk in the forest here, the forest is a coming together of chaos and order, because when you look at the soil, it's full of decaying plants. There's death everywhere. All the vegetation, the soil, and the scent that emanates from the soil, it's decaying matter, something dissolving, but the decaying matter is food for the new life that's arising. The two go together. And on a human level, the evolution of consciousness often needs a regression into disorder because before a new level of consciousness can be reached. In my own life also, I had to go into despair, and I had to find a point of near suicide before an awakening happened. It was necessary. My life was just falling apart in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. Complete chaos. And it was, so it's often the case that the regression is necessary for the next level of evolution to happen. And that's, whether this is happening now, we'll wait and have to see it. But sometimes it is possible for evolution also to happen without the regression from time to time. But in this, where we are now, it doesn't matter where it is. I see the whole, in long term, I'm very optimistic about the evolution of human consciousness. Not necessarily short term, but I'm a short term undecided, but I'm a long term optimist, because I know that the evolution of consciousness is inevitable, because that's the entire purpose of the universe, is the evolution of consciousness. The universe is an awakening being. It is one being manifesting through countless forms of life. But every form of life, whether it's a person or an animal or a tree, every form of life is a temporary expression that the one underlying being has taken. So there's this, and gradually this one underlying being is in the process of creating this universe. It would be wrong to believe that the creation of the world is already finished, or that the creation of humans is if humans are a finished product, it would be very sad. You'd ask, can't God do better than that? If that's different, but not humans. Humans they're an awakening species, and that's fine. So I'm quite happy with the way things are going. If we need a regression, there's a French expression, excuse my French, but it's reculer pour mieux sauter, which means something like to step back in order to jump better. When you want to jump, you have to go back first and then you jump. So often the regressive step is necessary, but it's not perhaps always necessary. So we'll have to see. I've been speaking too much, perhaps.
No, perfect. This tenacity of egoic consciousness that seems predicated on separateness, how do you think it is a result of evolution that it is so tenacious, this ability for it to reassert? Do you see many of our systems and cultures as the ongoing assertion of this energy? Has egoic consciousness become the priority for the organization of our systems, our economic, financial and political systems? And also, when you said like that we seldom experience that awe, that awareness of the numinous, of the oneness, I feel perhaps there are many things, perhaps in sport and in creativity and then just in family, ordinary everyday life, where what is being pricked or plucked is that awareness for those moments of awe and beauty that you can just have with an animal or a friend or watching a football match or watching a film. I feel that that's when it reaches in beyond these thought forms, this object consciousness, and resonates within the space consciousness. Furthermore, Eckhart, if indeed we are part of this universal consciousness expressing itself through multiple forms, how do we engage with that conceptually? Because I sometimes feel, well, there must be such power in that. There must be such power in this consciousness that, and indeed, it's kind of beyond my appreciation of time. You know, like time in oneness, there is no time. Like when you talked about the decaying forest floor, it's only decay from a utilitarian perspective. If I can't eat that anymore, but some other things can eat it, so it's only when you objectify it that it matters. So I suppose my feeling for a while has been, after a time of infatuation with politics, that unless there is a sort of a fundamental change on a level of our consciousness, then there can be no material change, because all things are an expression of the inner state. All cultures are, all systems are. How could they be otherwise? Does that mean that it's our job to simply focus on our own individual awakening? How do we activate this understanding that you're conveying?
Well, you're exactly right. Just all the institutions and the systems that humans create must be a reflection of the collective consciousness, the general state of consciousness in humans. So the world that we create, the governments, the economic system, they're all, of course, created ultimately by the human ego. So as long as we are in the egoic state of consciousness, the external structures that we create are an expression or manifestation of that egoic state of consciousness, and will have all the characteristics of the state of that state of consciousness. And that's absolutely true. Therefore, ultimately the real change must be within the individual human, and that awakening must be within. That is why my main focus is on the consciousness on human consciousness, which is ultimately the universal consciousness. That's my main focus. It does not mean, however, that humans necessarily would say, I'm not going to take any action in this world, and I'm not going to participate in social interaction, in trying to create better structures or whatever it is, until I'm enlightened, or until I'm not completely awake, so I'm not going to participate. No, our challenge is as we participate, to stay as conscious as possible, so that we are not falling back into ego. But this only applies to humans who already know what I'm talking about, because they've had at least a glimpse within of what it is that these words point to. So you can participate, but you have to, everything you do has to be ultimately considered as a spiritual practice when you engage in talking to people, disseminating information, or even if you feel called upon to go on a protest march, so that you bring that presence into everything you do and say. So, and be very much aware that in any situation, the primary thing that matters is not the situation that you want to deal with or whatever you want to do. The primary thing is your state of consciousness at any given moment, which is the present moment. The primary thing, so to become aware of your state of consciousness while you're engaged in doing, speaking, doing, and sometimes often you might catch yourself and see you've fallen back into a reactive state. You may catch yourself falling back into a deeply negative state. And that's fine. Every time you notice that you're in ultimately a dysfunctional state of consciousness, that noticing is not dysfunctional. So when you notice that you have fallen back into ego, you're no longer in ego, because the awareness is suddenly there again. The people who are completely trapped in ego have no idea that they're trapped in ego. Because that means it's the same with people who are so-called insane or clinically insane. If you know that you are insane, you're not completely insane. It still may be difficult, but there's a knowing there. But if you're totally insane, you're totally in the grip of that mind structure, the insanity, then you don't know it. So we can engage with the world, but always realizing to be very alert. I think that's perhaps the key word. As you engage, as you talk to people, as you take action, as you interact with people on social media, make sure that you don't just type something in as reactive response, put out a lot of negativity, react to somebody who is very negative. It's easy to be pulled into unconsciousness by other unconscious humans, very easy. And so online you have to be doubly careful so that you don't engage in spreading unconsciousness into this world. So the world is there was once a 19th century thinker, French thinker whose name escapes me, said, every nation has the government it deserves. There's a lot of truth in that. It's not just government, it's all the structures. What does it mean, it deserves? It means it's an expression of the underlying collective consciousness or unconsciousness. That's how humans... And the thing is, no human can display behavior that is beyond their level of consciousness. So when they do silly things or bad things or violent things, that at that moment, that is an expression of their level of consciousness. They couldn't have done it otherwise. They were just not. This is why Jesus on the cross says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." In modern terms, he would have said, "Forgive them, for they are completely unconscious."
Yes.
They are in the grip of certain energy movements, which is thoughts and emotions. They are in the grip of certain underlying energy movements, and they're not even there. They're asleep. It's energy movements moving through them. So you have to be also very careful of what we might call the hive mind, especially in the computer age of social media, and the hive mind. So that this is the collective, that suddenly the energy movements they flow into your mind, and you think these are all your opinions and viewpoints. No, you have linked into the hive mind. And the hive mind, you have to be careful. It's very likely that the hive mind is not conscious, but unconscious. That there's a lot of ego in it. And you recognize it easily if other people are demonized or condemned continuously, or groups of people. Then you know you're in the collective hive mind, the egoic collective mind. Very dangerous.
It's interesting that we live in this atheistic time with its fixation on materialism, intelligence, and logic. This sort of certainty that everything can be measured and technocratically measured, that you can harvest data and observe people's behavior and predict their actions as a result, that there is a determined, I would say, removal of the sacred. And I feel, Eckhart, that unless people engage with the idea of the sacred, by which I mean oneness, love, divinity, and that, to use one of your earlier analogies, that beneath our temporary ripple form, we are participants in one ongoing phenomena of beingness, unless our systems are organized on that principle, we will continue to perpetuate conflict. And what is, I think, so difficult is, how do you, like, when I think about myself, which that's basically all I do, I recognize that I'm continually stimulated by fear and desire, and sometimes this fear and desire is internally manufactured. I'll just start getting frightened about something that might have happened, or I'll get frightened about something that has happened in the past. Or desire, I should have this, I should have that, I want people to think of me this way. But I noticed that whilst these are sort of indigenous traits, fear and desire being sort of fundamental to human survival, to obviously fundamental aspects of human survival, these are also ideas that are promoted, stimulated, like a sort of an ever-present, almost pornographic objectification and sort of titillation of sex, which is sort of, I suppose, changing somewhat because of identity politics. But even identity politics, to a point you made earlier, is about identification. And I can understand why people that are from oppressed, marginalised, neglected or ignored groups would want to assert that their identity is as valuable as any other identity, but I can sense that there isn't yet an emergent recognition that actually we are beneath the outward expression of ourselves is more important than the choices or otherwise that we use to express our outward self.
Yes, that's very true. And so one could almost say we need to learn to live in two worlds. One is a world of form. That's you as a person, not only the physical form, which includes, of course, we talk about race, color of your skin, physical. That's perfectly fine. We're not dismissing it as totally irrelevant. I wouldn't want to go there and dismiss the world of form as totally irrelevant, because if you do that, the world of form, if you say, oh, it's all, or you could say the form is all illusion. Some people say that on the deepest level, it's kind of true, but I don't want to go there. If you dismiss the world of forms, it's all illusion, I don't have anything to do with it anymore, you're in for a very rude awakening, because the world of form will challenge you. Even if you deny it, it will challenge you. It's here to challenge you. It's not here to satisfy you. It's here to challenge you. But you have to, instead of in some spiritual traditions, there was complete turning away from the world. And I don't think that is the way to go, especially for us now. To accept the world of form, and as I said before, to honor it, that is also important, and that includes racial consciousness, for example, to see that your race is actually, there's great value in that, and there's a huge tradition, there's all your ancestors and so on. For black people or native, especially native people too, they have all the suffering of their ancestors that goes back centuries, and all that is important to recognize and to become aware of. And they might find that within themselves as what I call the pain body. Pain body is accumulated emotional suffering from the past, your personal past, suffering from childhood. It doesn't just disappear. It leaves traces, energetic traces in you of pain, emotional pain. And humans carry this pain body, which is like a little entity that periodically comes up and wants to actually experience more pain. I call it the pain body. In relationships, people often have it every 2 weeks or whatever. They go through their drama. The pain body overreacts to something because this energy field of emotional pain that lives in you, almost autonomous kind of, a little being, not happy. It's suffering from the past, emotion, it lives in you. And of course, that wants to come up periodically because it needs more suffering to feed on. In personal relationship, it does it through drama. It presses the other person's buttons. It wants an emotional reaction. It wants the drama. And once it's in it, it doesn't want to, it wants it to continue. And that goes on for a while until it's absorbed enough energy it's the same energy frequency, one could say, that its own being is this energy frequency of pain and drama and unhappiness. That's a personal pain body. It can feed on your mind too. The emotion rises up into your mind and then controls your thinking. And so when you're not aware of it, the pain body is the emotional aspect of ego, a very destructive emotional aspect of ego. When you're not aware of it, it becomes part of your ego. When it amplifies what you think, then your thinking becomes deeply negative, either about yourself, about life in general, about other people or groups of people, whatever, about God. It's very negative. So your thinking is controlled by emotion from the past. Another aspect of the pain body is the collective aspect. It's not just personal. Every country has a certain energy field, which is the collective pain that has accumulated in the energy field of that country, the psychic energy field of the country. Some countries have a much heavier pain body than others. If you're sensitive, you can feel it when you arrive in a country. You step out of the plane. Well, nowadays you don't fly anymore, but anyway. You step out and you can already feel, sometimes it's a heaviness in the energy field. countries like Germany and Russia have a fairly heavy pain body. I can always feel that when I arrive first, because there's been a lot of suffering in those countries, enormous suffering on a collective scale, both suffering self-generated and also suffering that has come from elsewhere. In the case of Russia, the suffering created by first the Tsarist regime, then the Russian Revolution, and the horrible communist regime, then the invasion of Russia through Germany, and incredible suffering of millions and millions, dreadful, and the suffering inflicted by communism on Russian people, millions and millions died. Germany, everybody knows the suffering that's self-generated in part. Germans, the Holocaust, the wars, and so on. So there's suffering in the energy field. In Russia, I was in Russia, but the suffering often means that there's a greater readiness for spiritual awakening. I saw in Russia, for example, I went to Russia a couple of years ago to give a talk. There's an enormous longing for spiritual awakening because they know the suffering, they can feel the suffering. I've never been to Russia before. It's the biggest talk I ever gave in Moscow, 6,000 people. Never been there before. And in Russia, I could see when you walk in the streets or go into a shop, people very rarely laugh, smile. You have to be serious. The first couple of days, I smiled a lot, and people looked at me as I was insane. And then on the third day, I said, okay, I'm going to just be serious too. And then I got a compliment a couple of times. People said to me, oh, you look Russian. So I was fitting in. I didn't smile anymore. But that in the Russian soul, the Russian collective, was enormous longing for spiritual awakening. So often it's the case that people, or in countries where the pain body is heavy, those people are also very often at a greater point of readiness than somebody in whom the pain body is still relatively light. Because you are continuously experiencing suffering that's generated by your pain, whether it's personal or collective. Interesting, even in countries like Canada and the United States, in many ways they're very similar culturally and so on. When I drive across the border from United States into Canada, or the other way, and the landscape is the same, everything is the same, and yet the moment you cross the border, when you go into Canada, you feel more of a lightness, a bit more. You can suddenly breathe, take a sigh of it's a more gentle energy field. When you drive back into the United States, a more nervous energy field. It depends where in the States you are. Such a huge country. There are different energy fields in the States, of course, many different energy fields. But as a whole, there's a much more nervous energy field. But of course, it's also more dynamic. So that's another aspect of it.
Do you think these energy fields are a reflection of culture and human activity? Or do you believe that the land itself, almost the geology and geography, might have character that comes through places? The subject of psychogeography, there's a place in London, Eckhart, where near Tottenham Court Road, the area of St Giles. This place was when there was the gin epidemic of the 18th century in London. This was where all the gin houses were. And then when I was a drug addict, 300 or 400 years later, like that was where you would, like, the last resort. If you can't get heroin anywhere else, that is the place you go. Every so often they try to gentrify this area. They've tried again, actually, with a sort of an international rail link, but it's like there's something in the energy there that is, in this case, to do with addiction, hedonism, self-destruction somehow. I wonder if there's some character there. And while I'm on this little flow, I sometimes feel that in addiction, when you watch people with very severe addictive tendencies or chemical dependency, it is like they're trying to destroy themselves, but are going about it in the wrong way. It reminds me of your famous phrase, "I cannot live with myself any longer." A lot of addicts will use idioms like, "I want to get off my head. I want to get out of off my face. I can't stand myself." People are trying to escape from themselves. It's like the impulse is a spiritual impulse, but there is no culture, no mechanic, no teaching, no tradition to guide them.
Very true. So there is often in addiction, could also be alcoholism, there's an unconscious longing to be free of yourself, of the self. Because its experience is such a burden to live with yourself, and I experience it too. But many people, they go to the drugs because, as you just said, the self is experienced as something very heavy, and it's a burden. And then what they do is they by the intake of these things, temporarily frees them from themselves. But of course, they always have to come back. But how does it free them? It frees them from themselves by taking them below thinking. It takes you below thinking, and that's one way of becoming free of the self, because the self is mind-generated. It's a mental image. If you go below thinking, it gives you temporary relief. You can also have sometimes people, just before they go to sleep, you're already halfway between the state of wakefulness and sleep, and you can suddenly feel this enormous sense of well-being as you move towards the unconsciousness of sleep, because you've been freed from yourself and all your problems and all the turmoil in your mind. You're so tired that you don't remember the turmoil of your mind anymore. So you're falling below. This is one way of becoming free of thinking, is to fall below thinking. But that is not the way for humanity is not destined to regress to a pre-egoic state, to a pre-thinking state. That's a wonderful state for animals and nature to be in. But for us humans, our destiny is to rise above thinking. Doesn't mean we don't think anymore, but we transcend thinking in the sense that we are no longer trapped in the movement of our mind. We rise above it. We experience awareness, that is alertness without thinking when we want to. And then we can think more productively and more creatively. So we transcending doesn't mean that we completely think we still need our minds. We need to think, but not the destructive, problem-making thinking of the egoic mind, which is lack of awareness. Our destiny is to become free of the self by rising above it, transcending, not falling below. But people who are spiritual, ready for spiritual awakening, and they go the wrong way. They feel the heaviness of the self, but nobody has taught them that it is possible to rise above instead of having to fall below thinking, before the thinking mind. So our destiny is to rise above. And then we don't need all those things anymore that take us below the thinking mind. I tried a few drugs because sometimes, some years ago, people ask me questions sometimes. So I thought, in order to answer the questions about drugs, I need to try some, because what can I say if I've never taken them? So I tried, of course, pot when we were in Amsterdam, and I can see what it does to people. They smoke, and you can feel that kind of wooziness coming over you. And then I saw it was good to experience it. I much preferred my normal state of consciousness, so I was very happy to come. And I was still aware even while it was happening. So, but okay, I thought, okay, I don't need this again. I know what it's like. I also tried acid, LSD, on another occasion many years ago. And again, because I needed to know what people were talking about. And what I experienced was an enormous amplification, for example, of sensory perception, as if everything was shouting at you. Every sense is enormously amplified. The sense of smell, of touch, visual things. I was looking at the wall, and the wall was alive. It was throbbing. The wall went boom, boom, boom. And everything, the water had a certain smell to it. Everything was amplified. The world was shouting at me. And of course, I didn't experience it as particularly pleasant, but I know why some people feel drawn to it, because it cuts out your thinking mind, because everything, the experience is so overwhelming that the whole conceptual mind stops. So it can give a person a glimpse of what it also, I mean, sometimes you see the miraculous nature of simple things. You hold up a glass of water or something and say, this is so amazing. And it is. But I mean, ultimately it is amazing. But before you didn't realize it, because you experience the world only through your conceptual mind. Everything becomes immediately conceptualized. So you inhabit a dead concept. It's not only a conceptual universe. Your whole identity is a conceptual identity, which is ego, mentally fabricated identity, and to be taken out of that. So for some people who are very much trapped in their conceptual mind, I imagine it's a revelation to experience something without the interference, without this dense screen of conceptualization. And you say, wow, the world is so miraculous, which it truly is. But I think for some people it might be an opening to have that experience. But if you become dependent on something for you to experience that, ultimately it will lead you astray. It will not ultimately help you to rise above thinking. It will eventually take you below thinking. So, although it can be an opening perhaps for some people, as Huxley wrote about it, the doors of perception and so on. It can be an opening. But once you know the state of presence, it's so much more beautiful and alive than anything you could experience through any kind of substance. And so again, I never needed to experience it again. But now at least I can answer questions when people ask me, is LSD like this or that? I say something about it.
With some natural psychedelics, which I have not experienced actually, I just took LSD when I was younger, people talk less about the heightened sensory experience and more about the dissolution of the self. And in cases of some psychedelics, a real engaged experience with an other entity, often personified, elsewhere feeling like a spirit of nature. And as a person in recovery, I don't drink or use drugs one day at a time. When I hear these descriptions, I feel like the excitement and attraction that I feel, I believe, is a kind of mobilization of my own intuitive knowledge that there is a God, that there are other frequencies of consciousness that are operating, that is possible for us to experience. And indeed, when you talked about like that sensitivity and intuitive awareness of the character of land and different countries and places having pain bodies and frequencies, I can see that if you're, because I've, all the time while you're speaking, I'm aware that I find it really hard to not think. My mind is very, very busy. I need to be sort of quite particular. I know from speaking to you before that you don't meditate, you just remain continually present. It's not like you go off for 20 minutes or half an hour or anything like that. And I feel that obviously you had a kind of very stark epiphany that seemed like, one day you were this person and the next day you were another person. And the awareness behind the person, I suppose, to use your terminology and your own explanation. But like for me, I do sometimes experience transcendence awareness. During this conversation I have, when I focus very much on what you're saying, I feel free and I'm completely present in the moment. But I have always had this tendency to return to carnality, always had this tendency to return to wanting, always had this tendency to return to caring about what other people think about me and if I've got enough status. I seem to have a lot of this, whatever it is that weds people to materialism and to the conceptual mind. It feels strong in me. What do I do about that?
Well, you don't really need to do anything, because if you attempt to get rid of something that you observe, then you very often give it more energy. If you fight something, you give it more energy. That's why, for example, the war against drugs didn't work. The war against anything doesn't work. So to be as much aware as you can, even as a desire arises, for whatever it may be, to be aware that there is a desire arising and just be there as the observing presence. Mm. For some people, for example, that's probably not the case with you, some people are addicted to food intake in order to fill some gaping void that they experience, or to dull the pain that they experience. And they find themselves already munching something and they didn't even know how it got into their mouth because the movement was unconscious. If you can observe a desire, if it's food or if it's drink, desire arising to go to the fridge and get out the chocolate cake, so you feel the desire rising, that's already an enormous gain in consciousness if you can feel the desire rising instead of just being the desire. So if you can feel it, and instead of condemning yourself for it, I would sometimes recommend to have a little gap before you do what the desire wants you to do. Have a little gap. Let's say the desire says, I've had a tough day, because sometimes desires are associated with mental explanations that to justify what you're going to do. For example, it says, well, that's the only thing that still, I'm not going to renounce drink because it's the only pleasure I've left in life. I deserve it. Everything else has been taken from me. It's the only thing that I have. For example, kind of justification. Or says, okay, I've had a tough day again. I deserve a treat. I'm going to have that chocolate cake. That's fine. So if you can observe, not only the desire can exist on purely energetic level as a longing, a pull, it can also at the same time exist on the level of verbalization in the mind. It could justify why you deserve it, why you need it, why you want it. And if you can observe that and just delay it for a couple of minutes before you actually do it, instead of wanting to completely suppress it, give it a couple of minutes or so to simply observe the energy behind that desire, or to observe what your mind is saying, to just be with it. That increases your consciousness, your awareness grows through it. And even perhaps it's still so strong that you still do it, but at least there's still an awareness there. You're no longer totally in the grip, and then not fall into the mistake of condemning yourself afterwards, because that's ego too. If you condemn yourself, as you see, I'm not good enough, you can't, because self-talk many people have self-talk in their head. They talk to themselves. Either they say I or they say you. They have two people that argue with each other. So it says, so why can't you see all your spiritual practice is useless? You can't do it. You always fall back to the same. You're no good. And then the other one says, yeah, but I can't help it. I deserve a little bit of pleasure. What's left? It's all the mind talking. Can you be aware of that? And if that awareness grows, then you use all these opportunities for just a bit of bringing some awareness. And gradually the force of the desire will diminish if you bring more awareness in. And then there's a space around it. It's no longer all-consuming. Now, of course, there are some drugs that are so destructive that heroin, for example. Now, heroin is one I'm not going to try, even though people might ask me about it. But
it's very nice.
I have known people who had how destructive it can be for many people. Where the question is whether that that awareness is there in a human being already, whether that's not something that you can just bring about. It's almost like grace to have a minimum of awareness that suddenly is in you. And perhaps it comes through suffering for many people. Eventually, it brings you to an awareness. I've met many people in my retreats and talks who have come through what's it called, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. That has been an opening for many people into the spiritual dimension. And so then retrospectively, you can say you can even become thankful for your addiction, because if eventually it leads you to an awakening, then retrospectively, the addiction actually was a good thing. Any pain, any suffering that you have been through, if it leads you to this point of awakening, retrospectively, even if it all while you were in it, it was completely meaningless. Suddenly, it has meaning. It's brought you here. All the suffering has brought you to this point where you see the possibility of awakening and transcending and realizing the transcendent dimension to who you are, which is also the transcendent dimension of life itself. And so it's all worth it.
Thank you. Since you had that awakening, which for me it sounds like your experience was about pain, body, depression, suicide. Do you not feel it? Like, when was the last time that you had to be aware of desire or fear rising up in yourself? And if it isn't very often, how do you consume culture? How do you participate in a culture that, for me, as we've discussed, is a manifestation of that kind of egoic consciousness and continually tries to sort of attach nodes onto you to electrify you into fear and desire? What happens? When do you experience it? Do you ever experience it, the original phenomena?
I enjoy things. I enjoy a couple of glasses of wine with dinner. Do I have a desire? I suppose it could be called a desire. I would be, if I didn't have it, it would be fine too. So it's not I don't really have much desire for anything. My favorite, sometimes people ask me, what do you do for fun? I say, fun? Actually, my most enjoyable moments are the times when I'm not doing anything at all. I'm just enjoy the being of this moment. It could be contemplative. Sometimes I just sit here and look out of the window at the trees. I look at the sky. I breathe. I look at items of furniture, and it's just so peaceful and wonderful, everything around me. And and I could sit here for half an hour or an hour it is so beautiful. I suppose that's my fun. What's not what usually would be called fun, but to feel the being. Now, being is another word for what we're talking about. To feel ultimately, so it's not just what you see when you're contemplative. We contemplate things. Contemplate, by the way, is related to temple. It's sacred. There's something sacred to it. Contemplation. So if real contemplation, there's something sacred, because you mentioned the word sacred earlier, which is a word that you hear very rarely in the modern world. I haven't heard the word sacred on CNN recently or in the New York Times. Sacred is a rare word because most people have no idea what you're talking about, but sacred is a very important dimension. It's an aspect of exactly what we are pointing to here. So when you contemplate the world around you and in its beingness, the trees, but even so-called inanimate objects are actually like sometimes to just, you touch them, they're there in their simple beingness. And what really underlies all that is feeling within the joy of just being, the joy of being alive, of being. And that is what in India, in the Indian Hindu tradition, is called Satchitananda. Satchitananda are three words that are strung together as if were one word. Sat means being, Chit means consciousness, and Ananda means bliss. So if you string these together, being, consciousness, bliss is a single thing or no thing to realize what. So when you are in that state of Satchitananda, it's a simple realization that you are the beingness of you. But when I say you, it goes far beyond what you think of yourself as a person. You have transcended who you are as a person, because your personal history is totally irrelevant. You can whether you sit on your private jet or in a prison cell, you can sense Satchitananda within yourself. But it's more likely that you will sense it in the prison cell than in your private jet. More likely.
Oh, wow.
So that is the deepest joy. I find the deepest joy then in the beingness, beingness. So because we could divide again what we are talking about, the two dimensions, we could use the terms doing and being. These are the two aspects of life. The doing is to do with, because time is needed to do anything. You need future to do anything. You need time comes in. You're active. All thinking is doing. When you think, you're doing something. You're doing the thinking. Well, you're not, in many cases, you are not doing the thinking, but the thinking is done for you. It possesses you. You don't, people say, I think. They don't think. In most cases, when there's no awareness, thinking happens to you. You're not thinking. The mind has a life of its own. In the same way, you wouldn't say, I'm beating my heart. The heartbeat is happening to you. But this is also true in the absence of awareness. You are just possessed by the thinking mind. It does what it wants to do, and you think you are it. So that's just an aside. So the doing, thinking is doing also. The doing dimension, there's always the next thing that you need to be concerned with. What do I do now? What do we do next? Some people, doing is all they know. Again, same thing we talked before. Families, if you go to families, children, have you done your homework? Have you done, now do this, brush your teeth, do that. The only way they relate to their children is through some kind of, either they say, stop doing it or do it. So that's all there ever is. And there's something so vitally missing, and that's the being dimension. To be able to look at your child, to be able to listen to your child, to give them your complete attention, but not conceptually, but in that spacious awareness, to look at the child, to recognize their beingness. But only that is only possible if you recognize your own beingness, and then you recognize the child's. Now, the children, they know when that is not there in the family, in the home, in the family. They realize unconsciously that something is missing, because you only operate on the level of doing. And then as they grow up and then they reach 13 years old, often they become more and more unhappy. Many children these days become more and more unhappy. And even before that age, many children have attention deficit syndrome, whatever it's called, restlessness. And of course, yes, something has to do also with the continuous use of electronic devices, iPads and all that stuff. Yes, that has something to do with it too. But there's also the lack of the being dimension in the home environment, in the parents, because ultimately the child has never been recognized. That's for who they are in the depth of their being. All interaction has been taking place on the level of doing, which is the level of mind. Of course, they're all well-meaning parents because they want to do the right thing for their children. but no matter how much doing you do in wanting to do the right thing for your child, no doing is ever enough if you neglect the dimension of being. So that's essential. The two worlds, we need to have one foot in the world of doing and one foot in the world of being. Most of the world that we know is lost in the doing dimension, which means the transcendent, ultimately the sacred, the transcendent dimension is missing. And that's why a society needs to survive, needs some access to the transcendent dimension to give people. In traditional religion, yes, traditional religion has been 90% mind stuff, 90% egoic also, identification with belief structures, ideologies, making others wrong, all ego, we are right, you are wrong, all ego power, 90%. But there's always, it's kind of arbitrary figure, 10%, it's still provided, 10% is a very small opening into the transcendent. Even if just by reading some of the parables of Jesus or a few deep passages there are some incredible jewels in the Bible. There's a lot of mixed stuff there. Of course, the Bible is many, many books written by many people. So there are some great spiritual jewels here and there. And then there's a lot of cultural stuff too. That's cultural, very limited understanding. But anyway, religion has provided traditionally a small glimpse for quite a few people still, just a glimpse of the transcendent. For example, looking at Jesus on the cross, which at first seems a strange thing. If you come with an extraterrestrial here, you might think, why do these people are on their knees in front of a person who is nailed to the cross? This is so weird. But if you look more deeply, there too, it could, if it's used rightly, it's not always used rightly, it could have been some open, for many people it was a small opening into transcendent dimension. How? By identifying with Christ. The suffering of Christ is also my suffering. We are going through this suffering, and it gets you to a point of surrender or acceptance of what is, the isness. And that's an opening into the transcendent dimension. Any point of acceptance, even accepting the unacceptable in the present moment, doesn't mean if action is possible, you take action. But in this moment, you accept, especially if death approaches, or you're very sick, all this, you suffer greatly, enormous loss in your life. Humans, millions of humans continuously have experienced these things. There are points when only surrender is a possibility for you to be free of suffering. And you look at the image of Jesus. What does it point to? It points to join these. St. Paul talked about that too. The suffering of Christ is my suffering. So you, through identifying with the archetypal figure, one could say Christ is the archetypal human, and it shows what is possible because Christ is nailed to the cross, but the cross, which is a torture instrument, so he is nailed to the torture instrument, but the cross has a double meaning. The cross is also a symbol for the divine. So sometimes you see just the cross. The cross is a symbol for the divine. The cross is a torture instrument also. And you bring the two together, which shows that one important portal, a very important portal, and traditionally for most humans, into the transcendent dimension is suffering and the acceptance of suffering. And that way, traditional religion, not the ideology of it, but this direct experience, has traditionally offered a portal into the transcendent, and that for many people has disappeared now. So in many countries, traditional religion is kind of become quite meaningless. But that's just so it has taken away from humans that, so there many humans are at an intermediate stage now that has been taken away from them or has dissolved. They can no longer believe in, which is understandable, they cannot believe in the mythology anymore, that's all that. But they haven't yet found access to the transcendent dimension through another way, which of course is spiritual teaching comes in, but many humans have not yet had contact with any spiritual teaching. So we can now go beyond needing to, if religion does not work anymore for a human being, which started with Nietzsche, when Nietzsche said God is dead, of course he meant that the God that we created in our minds, that's so the access to the transcendent. It's very important to have that in your life. If you don't have that transcendent dimension, then life is just a veil of tears and frustrating. And that is suffering. Buddha said, Dukkha, suffering. All life is suffering. Dukkha, wherever you go, whatever you do, you will find Dukkha, which is translated as suffering. Other translations are unsatisfactoriness, insufficiency, misery, or just plain unhappiness. That's Dukkha. Wherever you go, whatever you do, you will find Dukkha. That sounds very negative, but the other part of his teaching is, in his own words, he said, I show you suffering and the end of suffering. Meaning, I show you how you create suffering by your unconsciousness with the self, which is a fiction. And I show you the Buddhist teaching is also to realize the kingdom of heaven, which the Buddha calls emptiness or spaciousness, which is a dimension of consciousness in you. If you don't find it, then life is suffering. The end of suffering is finding the transcendent dimension. Then life is still challenging, but the challenges of life are no longer converted into suffering. That's a miracle.
Yes. I can see that how like fun and pleasure are an unconscious attempt to kind of defibrillate the bliss that you described, Sat Chit Ananda. It's an external way of trying to vivify this dormant bliss that is lacquered into stasis by the dominant egoic consciousness. I like what you said about the image system around the crucifixion, that the God made flesh must suffer, must die in order to be reborn as God consciousness, as aware consciousness, after some time in the cave as well, after some time in the darkness of the cave. I'm thinking too about what you have said, Eckhart, in the recent both primarily mathematical analysis of the universe reveals that it's likely, because I believe that it's true, but from a mathematical perspective, possible that consciousness is a intrinsic part of the universe, not evolved from matter, which is no different from the paradigm of there is a creator, there is awareness, there is God in an even shorter word. And I like what you said too about it being a kind of intermediary moment, a shrugging off of the old orthodoxies and institutions, but not yet a recognition of the all-encompassing sacredness trying to really realize itself in the present. Of course, the thing that you have perhaps best known for is this be here now, presence in now, the power of now. And it seems to me that is your teaching often returns to come back to now. You said once to me, that the minute you finish teaching, that's it now. You're not that identity anymore. Now you are so that you are using the senses and awareness as kind of instruments of the sacred to continually bring you back to the presence, whether it's feeling the energy of your own body or using your senses to observe what's happening. Yeah, I've understood some things.
Yes, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So carry on with the wonderful work you are doing to bring consciousness.
Yes.
That's what's needed.
I will do this. I've gone back and forward all my whole life between ego and purpose. I get I recognize something and it feels very clear to me, and then my ego comes in and claims it and makes it its own, and then everything falls apart and explodes for me. This time I'm very determined very determined. I will just try to stay present and trust God. But thank you very much for showing me and showing everybody so much clear wisdom in such a simple, accessible, humorous and funny way. I do lots of stand-up comedy about you. I don't know if I've told. One day you will see the stand-up comedy show that I do, and I think you will like it. There's impressions of you. There's quotes from you. There's lots of things in my most recent show. So hopefully you will see that soon.
Oh, thank you. Great. Right. Thanks, Russell.
Thank you, Eckhart. Thank you for spending so long. It's the longest podcast I think we've ever done. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't that fantastic? I've learned a lot of life lessons there. Mostly just shut up and let Eckhart Tolle talk. I've I've created a pie chart of how much I was talking. It's represented by this little mouse poo in the corner here. The rest of it, that's Eckhart Tolle. What would you want other than Eckhart Tolle dispensing cosmic wisdom at an incredible rate? Go over to luminarypodcast.com to get more of these podcasts. All right, ta-ta, bye.